Hello again. This video is on assessment task 2, questions 4 to 7, your legislation table. So I've broken these videos down into 6 steps to help you answer the legislation table, which is in your assessment questions. Step 1 is to create an ALBIS report to give you background on your general obligations. Step 2 is to use Google to identify areas of compliance. Step 3 is to identify the legislation that relates to those areas of compliance. Step 4, to navigate this legislation and find the specific section that relates to your area of compliance. Step 5 is to complete the table in your template. And step 6 is to identify a form that will help you to comply with the identified section. So it does sound a bit confusing, but hopefully after you've watched this video and you've seen me go through 2 examples where I'll go right from the first step right through to the last step, that it will give you a bit of confidence and you'll be able to carry on and do those yourself. Of course, if you have any questions, definitely give us a call, especially if you're finding it difficult to find the legislation. There's things we can do to help you out there. Okay, so we're looking at legislation that relates to your business. So one of the best websites you can use to start with would be the Australian Business Licence and Information Service, which is ABLIS, A-B-L-I-S. You can do a Google search on ABLIS and it will take you to this page. So what ABLIS will do, it says it will take 10 minutes to enter your information. It realistically takes about 2 minutes. But you answer a few questions and they give you information about licenses, regulations and council approvals and your compliance requirements when you start your business. So it's a really useful search, and it makes it more specific to your own requirements. To go in, you go in and put in your type of business, which will be electrical, and it will give you a few options. So most of you will be electrical installation work. Next, and then you put in your location. The other questions are very specific to your own business. So you'll just go through that and answer all the questions, and in the end, at step 4, it'll give you search results, and it'll give you a report that you can get emailed to yourself as well, that'll tell you about the legislation and requirements around your business. So that's a really good starting point. The next thing to do when you start to look at completing your legislation table would be to look at each area separately. So to start with, we will look at taxation obligations. So there's lots of taxation obligations for your business. There's the requirement to pay income tax. It could be what's required on a tax invoice for GST, what your requirement to withhold PAYG from wages to your employees, your requirement to pay income tax instalments. So these are all things that are legislated. So they're requirements under law that you need to do when you run your business or start your business. So the one that we will look at will be what's required on a tax invoice for GST purposes. So the normal process that that I would go through, and that I'm sure you would as well, would be to do a Google search. When I want to find out something, I'll type it in. What is required on a tax invoice? And the first option that comes up is the Australian Taxation Office website, which we know is reputable. Click on there and it'll tell us everything that needs to be on a tax invoice. Tax invoice for less than $1,000 and for tax invoices over $1,000. So this is really good. It's an easy way to understand what needs to be on a tax invoice, and that's perfect if you're just researching and finding information. For the requirements of this assessment, we actually need to go further than this, and we need to see the legislation behind what the ATO is telling us. So we will now do a search for the GST legislation. So I will just type in GST legislation. So normally after I've done a Google search, I will have a quick look down and scroll down just to make sure there's no other legislation, so no other acts or regulations that are more recent to this legislation. And specifically, most of the time I will check to see if there's legislation that relates to Queensland first, but as I know that taxation legislation is on a federal level, I'm not going to do that in this case. So I've got GST legislation. We've found the legislation that relates to GST, which is a new tax system, Goods and Services Tax Act 1999. We go into this act. As you can see, this act is quite big. So if we scroll down, how many pages is it? It's, even the contents page is big. So we'll look, it's like 400 pages. So we don't want to read the whole act, that would just be a waste of our time. So what we'll do is we'll use the Control F or find function to find the area that specifically relates to invoices. So we hold down Control and F, which brings up this box. We'll type in the word invoice. Yep. So the word invoice has come up, it's still searching. But the word invoice has come up 96 times. So we're going to look at the first time that it's come up in those 96. And here it is now, Subdivision 29C, Tax Invoice and Adjustment Notes. So this is possibly an area where I'll be able to find out what's required on a tax invoice. So I'm going to go to section 29-70 and find out what, see if that answers my question on what's required. So we'll go 2970. So as you can see, this is all in numerical order, and I'm just looking at these numbers. 20, that's 1325. So 2970, 27, 2910. Okay, 2970, tax invoices. A tax invoice is a document that complies with the following requirements. Well, that sounds good so far. It's issued by the supplier or of the supplier supplies to the document relates. Yep. It's in the approved form. It contains the supplier's identity and supplier's ABN. If the total price of the supplier or suppliers is less than 1,000, what needs to be on there? So that's good. That's all my requirements on what needs to be on a tax invoice. So that's great. What we've done there is we've found the legislation. We've found something that we need to comply with. We've found the legislation that relates to that area. We've navigated the legislation and found specifically where it states what needs to be recorded on a tax invoice. And now we're going to record all that information in our template. So we'll bring it up. It's in the taxation area. So we'll copy and paste the name of the legislation, which goes in your first column. The next column is the section and description, which we'll also copy across. So this was section 2970, tax invoices, section. Now the description, I can put on what is required on a tax invoice. How are we going to comply with this section identified in question 5? So how are we going to comply with that requirement that we've identified? So we're going to ensure that tax invoices have the required information, such as business, identity and ABN. Okay, what's a form or a checklist or a policy or procedure that can help us to comply with this section of the legislation? So with this section, it could be having a tax invoice template. So that could be a template that you've done up in Word, Microsoft Word. It could be one that's in your accounting system, so it could be in MyOb or in Xero. It could be something that's already in your job scheduling system, like SimPro or Arrowflow. So it would be like a template invoice that you have that's already pre-filled with the information you have to have on there, such as your ABN and your business name and address. Okay, so the next area we'll look at is consumer rights. So if we looked up, started with a Google search, and we looked at consumer rights in Queensland. So there's I've googled consumer rights in Queensland. It's come up with some guarantees relating to the supply of products and guarantees relating to the supply of services. So as an electrical contractor, you're supplying products and services. So you could select any of these items. Now for this assessment, where even though this is like with the tax office, this is a really easy way to understand and find out what your requirements are under the legislation. We actually need to go back behind that and look at the specific legislation and find the section that relates to these guarantees. So we will go out of this and go and do another Google search. So we'll do consumer rights legislation in Queensland. Okay, so in here it's saying that in Queensland that there's a new legislation that's replaced the Fair Trading Act and Trade Practices Act, and now there's a federal-based legislation that is administered through the Australian Consumer Law. So that legislation is, I can have a look at resources. The Competition and Consumer Act 2010. Okay, so now that we've got the Competition and Consumer Act 2010, we've identified what's the legislation that relates to consumer rights. Now we're going to find where in that legislation that it specifies about the guarantees relating to the supply of services and the supply of goods. So we'll do a search of each volume, because each volume in itself is huge. So volume 1's got 110 sections, volume 2's got 186 sections, and volume 3 has got a huge amount as well. So we're just going to do the search, use the search function again. So Control F, type in guarantees. Oops, spell it correctly. Okay, so there's nothing in volume 1 about guarantees. Volume 2, when you can hear that ding, it means that it's not finding anything. Guarantees, oh, it's got 2 here. So this is terms excluding consumer guarantees from supplier recreational services. No, that doesn't sound like it's about guarantees relating to goods and services. So we'll go to the next one, which is the same thing. It's about recreational supplies. So no, there's nothing in volume 2 that relates to guarantees. Volume 3, Control F, guarantees. Okay, we've found something. So there's 37 times that guarantees mentioned in Volume 3. So we've got guarantees relating to the supply of goods, that's excellent, and guarantees relating to the supply of services. So that's exactly what we're after. So we can look at any of these. So you can use any of these yourself. You just can't use the one that I'm going to be doing now, which is the one that's that I'm selecting for this video. So this one I'm going to use is guarantee as to a reasonable time for supply. So that's section 62. Okay, so I've scrolled down to section 62, guarantee as to reasonable time for supply. Now this section of the legislation is stating that if you are supplying a service to consumers and you don't have a fixed contract in place for the supply of the services, that there is a guarantee that the services will be supplied within a reasonable amount of time. Now this really applies to you as electrical contractors. So when you're doing a job, say you're installing a solar system, you can't start the job in January, get busy doing other things, not get back to finish the job and leave it until March and then come back and finally finish the job in March. 3 months to install a solar system wouldn't be considered a reasonable amount of time for a tradesperson to do that job. And if you were to do that, it would mean that you're not following or you're not complying with your requirements under this legislation. So this is a guarantee to a reasonable time of supply. So we've found the legislation that relates to consumer rights. We've found a section of the legislation that relates to us specifically, and we're going to put all this information now into our answer template. So the first section, first part of our answer is putting in the legislation. So we go down to consumer rights. First column is legislation. So we copy and paste in the name of our act, which is Competition and Consumer Act 2010. The section and description. So the section is section 62. Guarantees as to reasonable time of supply. Yep. So the description, there's a guarantee that services will be supplied within a reasonable amount of time. How are you going to comply with that? You're going to ensure that you do that. So you're going to ensure that you do ensure that I supply services within a reasonable amount of time. You could also have a contract in place as well that states out start and expected end times. So you could have that on your invoice, create expected start and end dates, or record expected start and end dates. On customer quote. So before you do the job, you provide them with a quote, and on there you've got an expected start and end date. That would mean that you're complying with this legislation as long as you complied with that invoice and you actually started and completed the job within those dates that you had on your quote. So what's a form, a related form or document or policy or checklist that helps you comply with that? It would be a quote. So if you're going to put that on your quote, expected start and finish date, then a quote would be what you would use for your form to help you comply with that legislation. Okay, so what I would recommend that you do now is I would start with this legislation table. I think you should start at consumer rights. That way, I've already started navigating through the legislation. You'll need to do this again yourself to get to the right section. But that way, you'll see there was other areas that you could have selected that were either the supply for guarantees relating to the supply of services or goods. So that would be a good place for you to start, and then move on, go back to taxation and go through each area, identifying their sections. Now, as I said at the start of this video, if you do have any questions, feel free to give us a call, or if you need any extra support, definitely give us a call and we can give that to you.